Let's start. As the chair of the Department of German, my name is Deniz Göktürk. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. This is a very busy time of the year, so thanks to everyone for coming out to this inaugural Mosse-Lecture at Berkeley. Special thanks go to our distinguished speaker tonight, Josef Vogl, Professor of German Literature, Cultural and Media Studies at Humboldt University in Berlin, as well as permanent visiting professor at Princeton University. He interrupted his engagement at Princeton this spring to come to Berkeley and give the first Mosse-Lecture here. Also special thanks to our very own and no less distinguished Martin J. Ehrman, professor in the Berkeley History Department, for generously agreeing to give a response and open up the discussion after the lecture. Quick word of warning, there will be about 20 minutes of opening remarks where I will try to explain how this event came about and also read a greeting address from Berlin. My colleague and former chair of the Department of German, Professor Hinrich Seeber, will also say a few words about the significance of the Mosse family and their connections to Berkeley. So please bear with us until we get to the main part, which is Josef Vogel's lecture and Martin J.'s response. The name Mosse is a multivalent signifier. A first association for many of you, as I've heard actually in conversations, is the famous historian George Mosse, an emigre from Nazi Germany who taught for many years at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. In Berlin, however, the associations with the name Mosse resonate further back to Rudolf Mosse, media mogul of the Weimar Republic and the inventor of modern advertising. The headquarters of his important newspaper, Berliner Tageblatt, were located in the Mosse House. See our poster. Do we have it up here? Yes, I think. Oh, yes, here, the Mosse House. The poster was designed by Jared Dury-Agri, one of our graduate students. The Mosse family was a Jewish-German family of great significance for the economy, cultural life, and the arts in Imperial Germany and the Weimar Republic. Elisabeth Kraus, professor of history at Munich University, has laid out the captivating family history of emancipation, prosperity, and exile in a hefty 800-page volume, Die Familie Mosse, which currently is being translated into English by Harriet Jernigan, a colleague in our department back there, and will be published by De Gruyter also as an ebook. Neither the translation nor the Mosse-Lectures here in Berlin and also Jerusalem would be possible without support from the Mosse Foundation. I would like to thank Roger Strauch from the Mosse Foundation for generously enabling these projects. And Roger is here with us today. I have very much enjoyed our conversations that have led up to this event, and I hope that our collaborations will continue. Roger, who is a Berkeley-based entrepreneur and philanthropist, is currently pursuing a quest for the lost and stolen art of the art once owned by the Mosse family. And I'm hoping that we can invite him back sometime to talk about that large-scale retribution project, which is going to see its first auction, I think, in June this year. Holding a Mosse-Lecture at Berkeley strengthens our existing ties with the Humboldt University in Berlin. We've been connected with the Department of German Literature there through the PhD net, das Wissen der Literatur, the knowledge of literature, which was inaugurated by Josef Vogl, and which enables an exchange between doctoral students and scholars from Berlin and Berkeley. The Mosse-Lectures at Humboldt University in Berlin are a prominent public humanities event. They present 2 series per year, and you can watch recordings of previous lectures on their website, Mosse-Lectures.de. The upcoming cycle of these lectures this spring is titled Zukunftswissen, future knowledge, or knowing the future knowledge. Josef Vogel's lecture will actually form part of that series in Berlin at the Humboldt University. And we are getting today, so to say, a preview of the Berlin event. The Mosse-Lectures at Berkeley are planned as a more modest enterprise. We are starting with 1 lecture per year. So the founders of the Mosse-Lectures in Berlin, Klaus Scherpe, who actually was my PhD advisor, and Elisabeth Wagner, were invited to attend today's event, but they could not make the trip. So they did send us a brief greeting address, which I'm going to read to you now. So, opening address by Elisabeth Wagner and Klaus Scherpe. On behalf of the Mosse-Lectures, a regular prestigious public humanities event at Berlin's Humboldt University, we are delighted to send our greetings and best wishes on the occasion of the inaugural Mosse-Lecture at the University of California in Berkeley. We hope that our cooperation with the Department of German will continue, and this lecture will become a successful recurring event connected to the Mosse-Lectures in Berlin. This cooperation would not have been possible without the generous support of the Mosse Foundation, based in Berkeley and represented by Mr. Roger Strauch, well known in the Bay Area as entrepreneur, investor, and benefactor of the Berkeley campus and other institutions. Roger thus continues a tradition of philanthropic and humanitarian achievements characteristic of the Jewish-German Mosse family in Berlin. Where the Mosse Publishing House was once influential in shaping the conception of democracy in the Weimar Republic. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, during the process of rebuilding the former East German Humboldt University, we took the opportunity to commemorate the history and legacy of the Mosses by laying the groundwork for a permanent lecture program, which was at the time inspired and supported by George L. Mosse, the eminent historian of German and European fascism. George himself held the opening lecture on May 14, 1997, with his speech on the liberal heritage and the National Socialist public. Ever since, with the precept of culture and science as a public commitment, more than 160 lecture events have been organized in Berlin with speakers of many disciplines from all over the world. Architects and artists such as Daniel Liebeskind and William Kentridge, cultural historians like Richard Sennett, Stephen Greenblatt, and Gayatri Spivak. Writers like the Nobel Prize winners Herta Müller and Orhan Pamuk have been our guests. Prominent speakers from Israel, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in particular, have been inspirational in reshaping the relationship between Jews and Germans, a relationship that has been so significant and fateful in the history of the Mosse family. In a series of books, we publish a selection of the lectures, most recently under the topic Europe and its Others and Narratives of Conversion. In 2017, we will celebrate the 20th anniversary of Berlin Mosse-Lectures and publish an almanac demonstrating the history and present activities under the name of Mosse. The upcoming cycle of lectures in Berlin is devoted to the topic, the knowledge of the future, from oracle to prognostics. And today's lecture will form part of that program. Josef Vogl, professor of literary and media studies at Humboldt University and highly influential cultural critic, is one of the leading voices on the organizing board of the Mosse-Lectures. It is a wonderful coincidence that Josef, presently at Princeton, could follow your invitation, thus strengthening the close ties that already exist between the Humboldt University and UC Berkeley. Unable to attend today's lecture, we wish you the best of luck for the event, and again express our deep gratitude to Roger Strauch and the other trustees of the Mosse Foundation who make all this possible. This was the greeting from Berlin. I would also like to thank Emily Jane Cohen from Stanford University Press, who is somewhere here, the publishers of Josef Vogel's book, The Spector of Capital in English. There were supposed to be copies here, but I guess they didn't make it. But
hopefully she's stuck in traffic, I'm guessing. So
yeah, so if they arrive, they will be for sale. And Stanford University Press also helped provide for refreshments tonight, which are back there and can be enjoyed after the lecture or even during. I would also like to thank Chris Hench, who is a PhD candidate in our department, for help with the setup and critical theory and then film and media for helping out with publicity and recording today's event. Thank you, Colin. Now, Professor Hinrich Seber, who is a former chair of the Department of German, say a few personal words about the personal and historical words about the significance of the Mosse family and their connections to Berkeley. And then after that, I will introduce Josef Vogl, the speaker.
So thank you very much. It's very exciting for me to be at this event, which seems to be closing the ties between Berkeley and Berlin even closer, and I'm very hopeful that it will even lead to more shared activities. I was asked to talk a little bit about the Mosses, the two Mosses, because there are two Mosses, and I will start with Rudolf Mosse, who was a leading publisher in Germany around 1900, and his grandson, George L. Mosse, who was a historian. His original name, first name was Gerhard, and he is one of the major historians dealing with German-Jewish relations. Marcus Moses, who was born shortly before the Juden Edict of 1812 granted Jews in Prussia partial and conditional emancipation, was the first to adopt the last name of Mosse. After his family moved from Posen to Berlin, the most prominent son among 14 children, Rudolf Mosse, started a very successful advertising agency, we heard already, which eventually developed into Germany's largest printing empire, the Mosse concern. Starting in 1871, the very year of German unification, he published the Berliner Tageblatt, which under the later editorship of Theodor Wolff from 1906 to 1933, until the Nazis took over, emerged as the most important Berlin newspaper, competing only with the more traditional Vossische Zeitung. This was at a time when Berlin, which is hard to believe nowadays, had an incredible number of 130 daily newspapers. Today it's 6. Typical successful Jews in Berlin's high society, Rudolf Mosse was very civic-minded. Already in 1895, Mosse started the Emilie and Rudolf Mosse Stiftung, a foundation to run an orphanage in a palatial building in Berlin-Wilmersdorf, which is still located in the Rudolf Mosse Straße. And in Berlin-Mitte, one cannot avoid seeing the new Mosse Palais on Leipziger Platz, number 15, an office building of 1998, the first one which was built on the Leipziger Platz after unification, on the very site of the Mosse residence of 1880, with its famous private art collection. We heard about it. The Jewish banker Gerson Bleichroeder, who largely financed Bismarck's political ventures and who was the biggest investor in the Ottoman Empire, was the neighbor in number 16 on one side, and the Ottoman embassy in number 12 was the neighbor on the other side, at least until 1897. Rudolf Mosse's is the typical success story of Jewish entrepreneurship and acculturation into German society. While very secular in his daily life, Mosse joined the Gesellschaft der Freunde des Judentums, the lively center of German Jewish social life, which founded in 1792, counted among its members Gerson Bleichroeder, the Hegelian Eduard Ganz, Friedrich Kemper, who was the prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, Moritz Lazarus, the painter Max Liebermann, the composer Giacomo Meyerbeer, Rudolf Pringsheim, who was the grandfather of Katja Mann, the wife of Thomas Mann, Walter Rathenau, Oskar Tietz, who started the department store Empire Hertie, and the other important publisher Leopold Ullstein. Franz von Lehnbach, who is best known for his iconic portrait of Bismarck, painted also Rudolf Mosse in the stately portrait of 1898, which you can see in the Jüdisches Museum in Berlin. On a more personal note, I was in the audience of the very first Mosse-Lecture after George Mosse's lecture, held by the architect Daniel Liebeskind in June 1997. He talked about architecture as umbauter leerer Raum, encased void, as he famously practiced it then in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Taking a special interest in everything Mosse for another, even more personal reason. 40 years ago, there lived on Keith Street here in the Berkeley Hills a lady named Käthe Olschky, née Mosse, whom I got to know as one of the many famous German-speaking Jewish exiles one could meet in Berkeley in the 70s. When she regularly attended the few selected seminars and lectures in the German department, I even had the chance to dance with her at a New Year's Eve party at my place when she was about almost 80 years old. She had two legendary connections which I found fascinating at the time as a young assistant professor. The first one, she was the widow of the famous Leonardo Olschky, who had been professor of Romance literature from 1918 until he was fired by the Nazis in 1933 in Heidelberg, where Hofmannsthal, the subject of my doctoral dissertation, had paid him a famous visit. The same Berkeley professor, by the way, who was blacklisted during the McCarthy era and who was eventually suspended in 1950 for 2 years. The second connection, Käthe Olschky was a member of the extended legendary Mosse family in Berlin, and as I had heard, a second cousin of the legendary George Mosse. Her paternal grandfather, Theodor Mosse, a physician, was the older brother among 14 siblings of Rudolf Mosse, who in turn was the maternal grandfather of the historian George Mosse, who was a major historian, as we heard already, of German ideology and the Third Reich and the German-Jewish relations. It was Mosse's father, Hans Lachmann Mosse, who, as the successor to Rudolf Mosse, hired the famous architect Erich Mendelssohn to redesign the Mosse house in Schützengraben. That's this picture here, down here, which was finished in 1923, one of the icons of modern architecture in Germany, where 15 years ago the Institute für Deutsche Sprache und Literatur at the Humboldt University was housed. I'm still grateful to Klaus Scherpe that he invited me to a lecture in 2003, which happened to be scheduled in that Mosse house. Only few people seem to know that Erich Mendelssohn, when forced into exile, ended up as professor here in Berkeley from 1941 until his death in 1953. In recent years, I have regularly met with Klaus Scherpe, whom I have known since 1975, and his wife Elisabeth Wagner. They have a cozy summer abode on a lake in Kaput outside Berlin, near Erich Mendelssohn's other famous architectural building, namely the Einstein Tower. It was in their lakeside garden a few summers ago that I first heard of another direct descendant of the Mosse family who lives in Berkeley, Roger Strauch. I was happy and proud to learn that the most generous patron of both the Mosse-Zentrum and the Mosse-Lectures lives among us here in Berkeley as a highly valued member of the campus community, who among many other contributions even endowed the Roger A. Strauch Chair in Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences, and who co-founded the William Saroyan Endowment for Armenian Studies, which I just learned apparently has many meetings here in this very room. As to the exact family connection to the Mosse family, it's getting a little bit complicated. It may suffice to say that Roger Strauch is the, now let me see, the step-grandson of Rudolf Mosse's son-in-law and successor, Hans Lachmann Mosse, who also died in Oakland in 1944. So he also was here. The successor to the famous Rudolf Mosse was in exile here and died in Oakland in 1944. There are many distinguished speakers. We heard already some names in the Mosse-Lectures in Berlin. I was in the attendance of one of the last lectures that was by the Germanist Klaus Priegleb, who talked on Heinrich Heine's Maranismus last June, and I'm very happy that now this kind of lecture series will now start also here in Berkeley. For all of these and many more reasons, mostly in terms of German intellectual history and some for personal biographical connections between Berkeley and Berlin, I'm very excited about the start of the Mosse-Lectures in Berkeley, and most grateful to all friends and members of the German department who helped realize it. Thank you so much, and thank you for your attention. Here I have a picture of Rudolf Mosse painted by Lenbach, and also a picture of the Mosse Palais, the original Mosse Palais on the Leipziger Platz. So if you are interested, you can just find someone here. Give it first to Roger.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Heinrich. So now we can get to Josef Vogl finally. So we're Josef Vogl is Klaus Scherpe's successor on the chair at Humboldt University. So we are delighted that he agreed to give this inaugural Mosse-Lecture at Berkeley. And Josef is no stranger to Berkeley. He was here as a Max Kade distinguished visiting professor in our department, I think in 2007. We worked that out yesterday, right? And Josef is one of the leading voices in German literary criticism, media studies, and cultural theory. He is not only a professor, but also a public intellectual who has a prominent media presence in Germany. His conversations with Alexander Kluge are all over YouTube, and I sent around the conversation on Moby Dick yesterday, and they have been published in the volume Soll und Haben, Fernsehgespräche in 2009. I laid out some of his books back there. You know, these are my own copies, so in case anybody wants to take a look. Insisting on the knowledge inherent in literature, he has provided new relevance and legitimization for the arts and humanities in our age of quantification and statistics. He's a great expert on Kafka and author of Ort der Gewalt, Kafkas literarische Ethik, 1990, With Kalkül und Leidenschaft, Poetik des ökonomischen Menschen, Calculus and Passion, the Poetics of Homo economicus. In 2002, he shifted his focus to questions of the economy. With Das Gespenst des Kapitals, 2010, translated as The Spector of Capital, and published by Stanford University Press. In 2014, he made a big splash in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, bringing literary studies and analysis to bear on our understanding of the world of finance and particularly derivative markets. In his latest book, Der Souveränitätseffekt, in 2015, he went on to argue that the entanglement between state and finance is nothing new. In fact, state and finance have been interdependent since the early modern period. Today's lecture, I think we lost the specter of capital, did we? So at least, we announced it as the specter of capital. I think the current title is The Strange Survival of Theodicy in Economics. Is based on his ongoing project to deconstruct the supposed logic and rationality of the market. He reveals the fictions and quasi-religious beliefs of perpetual growth, as well as asymmetries in the circulation of information, knowledge, and power at the heart of our capitalist market economy. And I think there are resonances with the recent movie, The Big Short. What his critique might entail in our current climate of growing divestment, civic disengagement and inequity, corporatization of public institutions like our own university, and the ever fiercer competition for funding and resources remains to be teased out in the subsequent discussion, to which I'm looking forward. Martin J., who will give the response, hardly needs an introduction around here. I will just say that with all his stellar and groundbreaking work on European history, on the Frankfurt School, and on permanent exiles, as well as the history of visual media, I cannot imagine a better suited respondent to be associated with this first Mosse-Lecture here at Berkeley. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joseph Vogl to Berkeley.
Thank you, Denise, for your kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation here and the hospitality in Berkeley. Thanks a lot to Roger Sprout for making this possible here and also in Berlin. And thank you to Emily Jane Cohen and the Stanford University Press for bringing my stuff here into English. I will say that the amusing part of this evening will end right now. Be prepared. I will talk about probably 1 hour. I am not angry if you go to some refreshments and whatever you want to do. And it will be a hard stuff to talk this evening because I'm talking about the notion of theodicy in economic knowledge. And my question is how economic theory is managing future and how economic theory is treating uncertainty, is treating also a kind of prognostic knowledge. And for this, I think we must know that we are now, for 8 years, good inhabitants of crisis, and we have gotten so used to the financial and economic crisis that it may be worthwhile to remind of what actually happened over the past few years. You remember, I just remind, it started with a crisis of private debt, with the American mortgage market collapsed in 2007. Next, the demise of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 transformed this local crisis into a global liquidity drama. This was the second phase. Then came the third. Due to stimulus spending combined with various bailouts and rescue maneuvers for the banking sector, as well as the injection of cheap money into the economy, the liquidity crisis turned itself into a budgetary crisis. Eventually, in the fourth phase, all this issued in what I would like to call the sclerotification of political decision-making, a crisis of governance marked by a problematic and confusing diffusion of authority among political agencies, economic agents, and democratic procedures. At this point, a crisis engulfing the entire capitalist system, including the political institutions and legal conditions of the system, was imminent. But of course, we now can see a fifth and final phase. For the crisis, or what have been so named, has turned out to be an effective means for solidifying the very financial system that led to the crisis in the first place. You'll be familiar with the basic facts. To be sure, the financial reforms announced in 2008 brought minor correction in the banking sector, but the economic order of 2007 has been effectively restored by governmental guarantees, debt ceilings, and zero interest rate policies, as well as increasing corporate concentration. Thus, the year 2009 was one of the all-time best for Wall Street. By 2010, there were more millionaires in the world with more wealth in their hands than 2007. And while about 60 million people more have slipped below the line of absolute poverty, the volume of international trade in derivatives in the year 2011 already exceeded that of 2007. So, since 2008, enormous amounts in Europe as in the United States, enormous amounts of public wealth has been successfully privatized, or, to put it plainly, redistributed. What can be said about what's been happening since 2008? Are there any striking aspects of this development that even we as naive spectators can get into view? Aside from the fact that the events of 2008 were immediately experienced as an epochal change, they had notions like Armageddon, once-in-a-century catastrophe, a violent earthquake, a watershed, the greatest melodrama in economic history, and so on. Aside from this experience, a first striking aspect is that the financial crash of 2008 was an intellectual catastrophe. Most experts were dumbfounded when, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, something apparently unexpected had happened. Speaking for all market liberals, Alan Greenspan, longtime chairman of the Federal Reserve, bemoaned that, I quote, his view of the world, his ideology, his time-tested doctrine had failed. The, quote, whole intellectual edifice of the financial economy had collapsed, unquote. Economists, it seems, were baffled by reality. That's all the more remarkable. And here is a second striking aspect, because global crises and crashes had been happening non-stop since the 1980s. The stock market crash of 1987, the Japanese crisis of 1990, the US bond market fiasco at 1994, the Russian crisis 1998, the dot-com bubble 2000, etc. Evidently, accidents turn out to be the rule, not the exception in financial markets, and what further intensifies the bewilderment about bewildered experts is the fact that that macroeconomic forecasting, the great proud of economics as a discipline, has turned out to be rubbish. In 2006, in its Global Financial Stability Report, the International Monetary Fund has attested to the maximum stability, robust health, and sunny prospects for the financial system. In 2007, the European Union lifted its last restrictions concerning international markets. In 2007, in March 2007, the US Federal Reserve, with Ben Bernanke as chairman, declared that the American real estate crisis had been completely contained. On September 10th, 2008, representatives of high finance, including Joseph Ackermann, the head of Deutsche Bank, were convinced that Lehman would survive. And according to orthodox statistical calculations, financial crash of such proportion was supposed to happen only once in a few billion years. Almost everyone was in the same uncomfortable intellectual position. After 2008, no single one-year economic forecast for the OECD states was accurate, typically missing the mark about 40%. And even on the occasion that the short-term quarterly predictions of a German council of experts, the so-called Wirtschaftsweisen, economic sages, were not completely off, these predictions were not unlike forecasts promising good weather on sunny days. Evidently, the knowledge of the future trumped up by economic experts had very little to do with the real future. But despite the obvious conclusion that the only safe prediction about the economy is the failure of economic predictions, in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, economists actually became even more obsessive about justifying the business of economic forecasting, and this is the third striking aspect. It is worth taking a closer look here to distinguish at least 4 different attitudes in this efforts at justification. So how do economists justify the failure of economic forecasting? A first kind of reaction consisted in the claim, a very obvious reaction, in the claim that the unexpected crash had proved not the expectations of economists invalid, but the activities of unreliable agents in the real world. In a lecture at Princeton given at 2010, the former chairman of Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, put the point as follows, I quote, "I would argue that recent financial crisis was more a failure of economic engineering and economic management than of what I have called economic science. Although the great majority of economists did not foresee the near collapse of the financial system, economic analysis has proven and will continue to prove critical in understanding the crisis. I don't think that the crisis by any means requires us to rethink economics and finance from the ground up." Unquote. We can take this as a kind of mantra of recent economics. If the theory doesn't match with the practice, then the practice must be wrong. Reality didn't just live up to the theory. A variation of this strategy, which is interesting as a matter for sociology of knowledge, holds that the predictions while incorrect, were fully plausible. A working paper of the Federal Reserve of Boston from the year 2010 reads, I quote, "The pessimistic case was a distinctively minority view, especially among professional economists. The small number of economists who argued forcefully for a bubble often did so years before the house market peak, and thus lost fair amount of credibility. They relied on arguments fundamentally at odds with the data, unquote. Taken literally, the argument is because it was a majority of the scientific community that missed the mark, its prediction must have been the only reasonable ones. Economic rationality and common sense stood against the dubiousness of mavericks and, naturally, the facts. A third, logically more sophisticated strategy was employed already early in the 1990s in a report of the Expert Council on Economic Development in Germany. It took the form of a general comment on the status of economic prediction. It reads, I quote, a very interesting quotation. Even when prognoses fail to come true, it does not follow that they were therefore worthless from the get-go. The principal purpose of prognosis is to identify possible problematic tendencies in the development considered most likely. The conclusion for economic policy drawn from such prognosis are not invalid simply because it failed to come true. That's the case as well for our prognosis from last year, which of course was completely incompetent. For the prognosis, it goes on, may well have caused a good thing and improved economic development, unquote. This defense is similar to the defense of a man quoted in Freud's interpretation of dreams, who was accused, you know the story, who was accused of returning a borrowed cattle in bad condition. For one thing, he said, when he returned the cattle, it was undamaged. For another thing, it already had a hole when he borrowed it. And third, he never even borrowed the cattle at the first place. In economic terms, first of all, we never made a real prediction. Second, there weren't any better ones. And third, the wrong prediction had the right consequences. A fourth position, a very elegant position, was taken up by some of the authority of neoclassical macroeconomists. Robert Lucas, probably you know him, for example, Nobel laureate and from the Chicago School, saw the surprise collapse of Lehman Brothers as a confirmation of economic modeling. Very interesting. In his own words, what we will lack in the future, as much as we lack it now, is a model that predicts the sudden collapse of financial assets, as happened with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. But that's not really newsworthy. The simulations were not presented as an assurance that no crisis would happen, but as a forecast what would happen if there is no crisis, unquote. So to paraphrase, economic prediction predict only what is already predictable. They are right when they are unnecessary, and when they are needed, they are useless. This is the agnostic heart of economic prognostication. The list of these intellectual exercises could be extended, but the upshot is as follows. Economic forecasts are immune to economic reality. They are derived from common sense that runs counter the facts. Real forecasts aren't really forecasts, and anyway, the only thing they predict is what's already forecastable or foreseeable. We can discern in this discourse the profile of a thought collective established in robust immunity to falsification, a basic epistemological requirement of scientific method. The economic historian Philip Mirowski construes the strange survival of forecasting in economics as the result of cognitive dissonance, a kind of dissonance whose dramatic core lies in the fact that contradictions between convictions and actual states of affairs simply cannot be resolved. Mirowski points to the research of the social psychologist Leon Festinger, who described a prominent example of such dissonance in a book written in the 1950s with the title When prophecy fails. Probably you know it. It was about the so-called Seekers, a Wisconsin group convinced that on a particular day in the year 1955, they would be rescued from a second-grade flood by aliens in flying saucers. When the predicted floods failed to appear, not to mention the UFOs, group members did not consider themselves refuted. On the contrary, convinced that their prayers had changed God's mind, they redoubled their efforts to proselytize. But there is a second conclusion to be drawn here, and this is the most difficult part of this talk. By the way, also for you, not only for me, but also for you. Although a few devil's advocates have begun to question the edifice of macroeconomic orthodoxy, it seems that the resistance of economic forecasting, despite its failures and refutations, point to an essential core of economic theory, to an underlying dogmatic substance that is preserved even to the detriment of reason, logic, and method. Indeed, predictive power is in the foundation of how economic knowledge is conceived, at least since the inauguration of neoclassical economics in the second half of the 19th century. Prediction and control, as Karl Menger put it, have been the declared aim of economic research. And from Friedrich Hayek to Milton Friedman, the ability to offer a, quote, correct predictions, or at least some structural expectations, is the criterion of the scientific status of economics. In his methodology of positive economics from 1953, a foundational text of contemporary economics, Friedman wrote, I quote, "The task of economics is to provide a system of generalizations that can be used to make correct predictions about the consequence of any change in circumstances. Its performance is to be judged by the precision, scope, and conformity with experience of the predictions it yields. In short, positive economics, so economics as a science, is and can be an objective science in precisely the same sense as any of the physical sciences." Unquote. There is nothing particularly surprising then about the suffering of cognitive dissonance. After all, nearly every macroeconomist and financial theorist since the 1960s had developed his career to developing deterministic models that have become so pivotal in economic analysis. These models are built on the assumption that economic changes and their consequences can be predicted, and that by studying such changes, we can get full view of price movements and risk distributions in the past, in the present, and the future. It's in this way that economists created a model world where incomplete knowledge, asymmetric interpretations, and unexpected events can be treated as meaningless, self-canceling, or just harmless. What is at stake in the question of whether economics are predictable systems is the coherence of economic theory itself. This point is particularly true of the kind of economic theory that has become dominant in describing markets, and especially financial markets, since the 1970s. What economists now call, and this is a famous theory, they call the efficient market hypothesis, claims, to put it briefly, that financial markets represent the operation of markets in the purest form. Unencumbered by transaction costs and unburdened by transportation and production, they are an ideal site for the operation of price mechanism and perfect competition. financial markets offer such ideal conditions of competition, first of all, that in all information about corporation, stocks, economic development is equally available to all participants. That implies, moreover, that prices for stocks and other stocks, options and other derivatives exhaustively contain or reflect all available information. These prices, thirdly, express the rational expectations of buyers and sellers who agree on the expected value of each financial instrument. And finally, and this is the most important point, under these conditions, new and previously unknown information is immediately made use of, and that, in turn, is to say, anything unexpected is immediately absorbed by the market, and the whole system perpetually tends toward balance and equilibrium. This has two implications. For one thing, the rationality of or efficiency of financial markets renders bets on the future no more promising than darts thrown from a blindfold ape or the stocking listings in a newspaper. The more efficient the market, the more perfect the randomness of price fluctuations. But second, an equilibrium does emerge because this random price fluctuations fall into a normal distribution around certain mean values. This is the most prominent theory of modern financial markets. This is the most prominent theory of how financial markets operate, and economists are always waxing rhapsodic about its beauty, about the beauty of market equilibria themselves. And indeed, the theory contains its own perfect justification. The more participants are involved in such markets, and the greater the means they put in play, that is, the greater the expansion of financial markets, the greater the stability they produce. At the heart of financial economic knowledge stands a rather special promise of order, and this promising prognosis cannot be severed from the theory itself. But what is the significance of these theoretical moves and tropes? How should we assess their status and consequences? What do they tell us about how our knowledge about economic processes operates? It's surely no surprise that the crux of such economic theory lies in a notorious subject that has long been embodied in the so-called market and market mechanisms. In several canonical texts since the 1960s, Friedrich Hayek, one of the founder of our present liberalism, undertook one of the most sophisticated elucidations of this strange subject, which also offer a kind of universal framework for situating the market in its historical and systematic context. So it's first of all worth noting that the market functions as a sort of Columbus egg, a brilliantly simple innovation in social ontology that satisfied an elementary yearning for order. Unlike any other part of the social world, markets are sites of, I quote, spontaneous order, and even if perfect equilibrium exists only in an ideal type, markets do indeed manifest a comforting tendency toward equilibrium. From Adam Smith's notorious invisible hand to Hayek's competition as a procedure of discovery, markets have emerged as self-organizing systems steered by self-equilibrating price mechanisms, negative feedback, and the interplay of supply and demand. By means of the markets, expectations are coordinated with expectations, and the singular decisions of individuals are referred back to the system as a whole. This was the first point. Social order. Second, for that reason, secondly, the market up to now is an exemplary realization of practical reason. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation, which appeared in 1767 as a second part of a course of moral philosophy, summed this up. For even though markets are driven by a particular self-interested endeavor, the market itself acts to transform the activity of individuals behind their backs and without their knowledge or intention, turning particular endeavors into universal benefit. By pursuing its own interest, writes Adam Smith, every individual frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good." Unquote. To this day, this is the moral pathos that directly or indirectly justifies the market and the price mechanism. For, according to Hayek, even though particular prices, especially for labor, may feel deeply unfair, these prices force individuals to put aside their own sense of what they merit or have to claim and instead to do their part with, I quote, the whole order of human action. Market-based competition, Hayek writes, works as, I quote, a kind of impersonal coercion that will cause many individuals to change their behavior in a way that they could not be brought about by any kind of instructions or commands, unquote. This is one of the most important topics developed by modern liberalism. The market offers an economic solution to the problems of moral philosophy. As Milton Friedman once said, it puts philosopher kings and wise lawgivers out of work. Thirdly, the effects of the invisible hands and of self-equilibration have led to what must be called the physicalism of market theories. This term implies not merely the hope of establishing political economy as a positive science on the model of physics, and hence as a value-neutral scientific undertaking. Rather, the history of political economy can be described in terms of prominent moments of crossover, where theories of the market are directly modeled on laws in the physical world. In the 18th century conceived the mechanics of self-interests along the lines of Newtonian physics. In the 20th century, market developments are calculated as probabilities on the model of stochastic theory. In all of these cases, it is not just a matter of analogies between physics and economics. Such correspondences are rather a major motivation for the ongoing mathematization of economic knowledge since the 19th century. Resource to these models in political economy is inspired by its resonances with natural science, and these resonances are triggered by a theoretical desire for general laws of equilibrium. Indeed, driven by the problem of how different factors, quantities and actions can be represented as balanced, driven by the question of how balance and stability can arise in complex economic relations, the discourse of economics crossed the threshold to its own formalization and achieved its approach to mathematical physics. In all this, the idea of market forces that tend toward equilibrium is not just a useful simplification of an all too complicated world. Instead, this idea ensures the possibility of economic knowledge as a system. The intellectual coherence of modern economics as a science ultimately depends on a proof that perfect equilibrium will obtain in an idealized decentralized economy. A theory of pure disequilibrium, after all, would be as nonsensical as the idea of a system without internal coherence. It is in and through a variety of physicalisms, and it is in and through a variety of physicalisms and in the transformation of economics in a branch of applied mathematics that the laws of the market equilibrium are embraced, and that, and this is important, that economic theory established itself as theory. On the status of theories of equilibrium writes the fate of economic theory in general. This naturally arises the question of how the economic doctrine, this economic theory of equilibrium, is supposed to apply to dynamic processes, irregularities, crises, or economic cycles. And the effort to answer these questions on the whole has taken three directions, which I would like to mention. First, on the assumption of a general equilibrium, it made immediate sense to explain economic fluctuation in terms of exogenous causes. Such explanation did not merely invoke the errors of frail subjects bumbling about in a confusing world. Since the late 19th century, radical defenders of economic equilibrium have poured enormous energies to the explanation of irregularities and cyclical changes. William Jevons, for example, who was one of the founders of neoclassical and mathematical economics, looked deep into the cosmos for explanation of economic fluctuation. He eventually determined the significance of the magical number of 11.11, the length in year of a cycle of solar activity that generates solar spots, which in turn have meteorological effects that impact grain harvests, which for their part bring about otherwise inexplicable price fluctuations. Such efforts were carried into the 1920s with great statistical zeal. Price fluctuation were also traced to special constellation of the Earth, the Sun, and the Venus that disturbed the magnetic field, with consequences for solar radiation and meteorological turbulences, once again causing price fluctuation on planet Earth. We thus owe this strange search for the efficacy of Venus or the Sun to the effort to save the principle of market equilibrium and to save the physicalism of economic theory in the face of manifest turbulences. Another approach, and this is very complicated here, but I won't skip it. Another approach to reconciling the assumption of equilibrium with real-world volatility was to tame the obscure forces of time and history by integrating them into the structure of economic models themselves. Such efforts are as old as economics, of course, and the most recent and most prominent of them was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1997. Probably you know them: Fisher-Black, Robert C. Merton, the son of the sociologue, and Myron Scholes were credited, I quote, with the most successful theory in the history of economics, unquote. Their theory had to do with the question of whether risk, as quantified and commodified in the form of derivatives, could be traded in such a way as to eliminate risk from financial markets. They developed a model for pricing derivatives, that is, for using the current price of assets, such as stocks or bonds, to calculate a price horizon which, seen from a future present, may assess a present future. This present price of a derivative is justified to the extent that the price already reflects the possible future development on the underlying asset. Only to the extent that future is already replicated in prices in the present can there be any reasonable expectation that trading risks will compensate for the risks inherent in the volatility of prices. This expectation, in turn, structures parameters of a famous partial differential equation, the famous Black-Scholes formula, which models stochastic processes by using a function for logarithmic normal distribution. In this formula, to put it very simply, the problematic quantity, that is, the unknown volatility of asset prices in the future, is assessed and quantified on the basis of the random walk of those same prices in the past. Importantly, this procedure does not require predicting specific events of all possible futures. It is enough to calculate the oscillations within which those futures may unfold. This calculus, in other words, depends on the assumption that what is unpredictable about the future will fall into the pattern established by what was unpredictable in the past. Prices may be unpredictable, but their volatility isn't. Rather than predicting specific outcomes, in other words, the formula predicts patterns of possible outcomes. Do you understand what I'm saying here? I'm do not understanding what I'm reading here. So, but let's go nevertheless. I think 2/3 of the talk is already behind you. This calculus, I must cite him. This calculus is remarkable in a number of ways. For one thing, it can be seen as a mathematical representation of current market logics. These logics are coded physicalistically, following the example of differential equations used to model diffusion processes in statistical mechanics. The presupposition of efficient markets is thereby built into the formula. This assumption allows for translating expectations about the future into expected futures, and hence for the taming of time. Uncertainties have not been made to disappear, but the thrust of this way of modeling markets is to suggest that an expansion of the market for derivative ought to usher in a world of risk neutrality. Uncertainty can be eliminated if there are enough demands or derivatives. In this world, the stabilizing forces of the market assert themselves once again, do they attest the effectiveness of balance and equilibrium. The end of history, that figure of hope peculiar to the 1990s, appears on the horizon. The Black-Scholes formula stands as the epitome of all model building efforts to construct a timeless and ahistorical economic world. It is not surprising, by the way, but this is only a joke, it is not surprising that US government at one point went so far to consider establishing a market for terror derivatives to predict the future of terrorist acts. However, it is unfortunately true that the hedge fund managed, according to Black, Merton, and Scholes' formula, went bankrupt in 1998 and led to the first great bailout in American financial history. The fact alone suggests some reservations about the direct transfer of physicalistic models to the empirical world, to the empirical market. From this derives a final consequence for the epistemic status of market theories. Friedrich Hayek, once more himself, had raised the question of how equilibrium models could be saved without failing in the face of patent unrealism. As he wrote in a famous essay in 1968, I quote, "The validity of theory of competition can never empirically be verified for those cases in which it is of interest," unquote. Its methodological character lies in the fact that it can be validated only by renouncing all empirical confirmation. Since competition consists in the production of unpredictable events by agents doing unexpected things in weakly defined situations, the concept of competition only makes sense where it cannot be tested by means of individual empirical outcomes. The concept of competition refers precisely to this open-endedness. Nobody knows who will win or lose in competition, know how, where, why, and by what means. And that means that an economic theory of competition or market can deliver no concrete predictions about particular events and outcomes in the future. It can make claims only about the kind of structures or patterns that will emerge through competition. Competition enables, as Hayek says, pattern predictions. Now, for one thing, the self-equilibrating market acquires a formal privilege. It is an idealized abstraction that merely shimmers through in its imperfect manifestations in actual markets. For another thing, the status of knowledge about the economic present and future gets reoriented. Accordingly, a system of mathematical equations may well describe a pattern of market equilibrium, but it would be an illusion to suppose that the algebraic technique could be used for the determination and prediction of numerical values. While the general conditions that led to equilibrium are known, the knowledge of concrete conditions and prices must be renounced. Predictions can thus be falsified without the refutation of predictions. All this amounts to the virtuosic effort to save the prophetic power of the market in the face of incomplete knowledge. In the spirit of Adam Smith's invisible hand, the equilibrating mechanism of the market and of competition only works under the condition that no subject, no participant, no politician, no economist occupies a synoptic position. Knowledge of the totality of market processes lies not within this or that observer, but rather, I quote, in the superiority of the market order itself. Precisely because the superior order of the market has subjected our economics to narcissistic injury, we remain attached to the superiority of the market as a subject. This is, I quote Hayek, the lesson in humility that the market teaches us. Let me approach a conclusion. From Adam Smith's invisible hand all the way up to the efficient market hypothesis, the same unshakable liberal conviction has prevailed that markets are exemplary site of equilibrium, regularity, and social order, and as such lend themselves to representations as a system. The market and its agents appear as guarantors of spontaneous order and mundane providence. Since the 18th century, political economy established and institutionalized itself along the lines of a theory of universal equilibration, asserting that the measure of its validity lies in its ability to prove that and how markets solve the problem of equilibrium. For a theory of economic dynamics, this assertion entails that its concepts suffice to describe a state of the system at any given time to derive reliable prediction about the future of the system. This market format is, on the one hand, a guarantee of the consistency of economic theory. It is non-negotiable, and its character is predictive. It aims at the taming of time and provides a providential perspective. The assumption of equilibrium show up not merely as helpful simplification or as utopia, but is moreover logically indispensable for this project. They are what guarantees the status of economic knowledge as a system. They are what produces a coherent field for economic analysis. On the other hand, these assumptions are subject to pressures of justification, which arises when the expectation of equilibrium is confronted with a confusing economic world or economic market by fluctuation, glitches, and crashes. Liberal economics thus faces, and always has faced, the riddle of whether and how these anomalies evince the system's rationality, whether and how existing market order can be proven the best of all possible economic worlds. It is natural, then, to discern patterns of argument in this way of framing models of the market that is analogous to the efforts of Theodicy. Liberal market theory follows the logic of the proof of God's existence. Thus, a theodicy such as in Leibniz aimed not merely at justifying the constitution of world in the face of mundane evils, rather, the model of concrete earthly conditions has to be conceived as the result of our limited earthly knowledge and perspective, which is transformed in God's synoptic vision into predictable order. The task, therefore, as Immanuel Kant once remarked about the efforts of Theodicy, is to prove that the inappropriate events in the world are not really inappropriate, or that they must be justified or judged not as given, but, I quote Kant, as an unavoidable consequence of the nature of things, as an effect of a world order that is satisfactory as a whole. Or finally, that they must be imputed to the deficient prudence of us feeble, mundane beings, unquote. And it is exactly such efforts that modern market theories have exhausted themselves. Accordingly, inappropriate actions combine to further greater purpose. In this way of the invisible hand, they cancel each other out. Also, crisis, accident, and crashes are the inevitable manifestations of the nature of things, of the errors and disorders of finite agents. But their vices only cast the dignity of the market system in heightened radiance. Finally, the appearance of disorder in empirical markets is owed to the limited knowledge of the participants, which revises itself at the sight of synoptic vision in the superior and immortal market subject. To summarize, at the heart of modern economic dogmatism lurks something that I want to call oikodicy or ecodicy, a teaching that makes all evils and catastrophes compatible with the wise arrangement of the system. In all likelihood, this is one of the greatest errors in recent history of knowledge or science, and it raises the question whether the latest financial crisis might not have a similar consequence as the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The Great Quake rocked the efforts of Theodicy to their foundations, and they survived only in Panglossian form, that is, as satire. May I have 3 more minutes and then I conclude? Okay. To conclude, I would like to point out something else. Economic forecasting now confronts the uncomfortable task of using models that preclude uncertainty about the future to produce a knowledge about uncertain futures. In the 1920s, Oskar Morgenstern, you know him, he was later one of the founders of game theory, observed that grand statistical exertion produced only failed predictions in economics. He actually asserted the double impossibility of economic prediction at all. For one thing, economic events are not tractable by means of statistical methods such as those used for insurance purposes that allow for the prediction of probabilities through the analysis of frequencies. For example, in the case of car accidents, diseases, or fires, whatever. In contrast to these cases, where individual events are independent of one another and changes can consequently be expressed in a mathematical ratio, economic events like price and price fluctuations show up in the format of time series. Changes cause further changes. Economic time series are neither stationary nor isotropic. Economic events provoke adaptive reactions. Statistical analysis, Morgenstern writes, disregards the actual temporal quality of economic events and is practically useless for prediction. For another thing, economic forecasting is a theoretical impossibility. If, for example, prices on market if, for example, prices on a given market are predicted to decline, that prediction will provoke an adaptive response. The prediction either causes itself to fail by influencing supply and demand, or worse, the prediction triggers cascading sales as in the case of financial markets, succeed in destabilizing the system. Unlike astronomy, unlike meteorology, economic predictions are implicated in feedback loops with the object, the economy, and are undone by anticipation. Economic forecasting undermines its own theoretical foundation and misses its own truth as a matter of principle. Economic institutes, Morgenstern concluded, exhaust their energy in dreary dilettantism and ought to forego such self-defeating prophecy. This, however, entails a further point with which I like really to conclude. If prediction is part of the architecture of economic theory, then there is a theoretical impossibility at its core which gives occasion to reflect on the character of economic prediction as a speech act. For in contrast to weather forecast, which fulfills its purposes in assertions about probable events, rain or sun, economic predictions fulfill their purpose only if their utterance makes certain events probable or improbable. They are not constative, but directive, provocative, or indeed completely moral in nature. In other words, they have the character of instructions. They posit norms and push for desirable behavior. Modern liberalism was always clear about that. For if an ideal market tends towards equilibrium and towards predictable structures, then economic science, as Hayek put it, retains one ultimate mission. The only way to approach the market ideal is to surrender oneself to the sway of the market. The way is to gain the power. The way to gain the power of prediction is to overcome concrete hindrances to the market. A maximum overview is attainable only in this way when the market comes to predict itself. Neither markets nor competition are given. They are normative, political, and historical goals. The sway of the laws of market requires resolute government enforcement. They are moral and social imperatives that serve as a measure for the constitution of market societies. And here, and it is here that I think our discussion can or should begin, and I thank you for your superhuman patience.
So thank you very much for staying around. Thank you, Joseph, for extraordinarily provocative paper. If this were the best of all possible worlds, I probably would have gotten a copy of the paper for yesterday morning. But alas, I did not, so I haven't been able to prepare serious and sustained and fully coherent responses. This did, however, compel me to read Joseph's book over the weekend in the anticipation that he would draw from that book. And I must say, Denise gave me a copy of it, that it was an extraordinarily stimulating experience. The paper we heard today is merely the tip of a very deep iceberg, and lots going on in that argument. I can't really develop many points, but let me just stress a couple. First, the issue of theodicy, the issue of the economic version, oikodocy, or however you want to pronounce it, of theodicy. Several major issues are raised here. First, we might say, is the use of religious templates to explain subsequent secular behavior. What is sometimes called the secularization hypothesis is evident in the work of someone like Carl Levitt, who argued that modern philosophers of history are secularized versions of Christian providentialism, or Carl Schmitt, who claimed that political theology was the source of contemporary political ideas. In other words, that what we have really is new wine but in old bottles. It's something which functions to diminish the legitimacy of the new, to diminish the newness of the new. It's merely a secularized version of what came before. Now, Hans Blumenberg, famously in his book Legitimacy of the Modern Age, pointed out that this was essentially a problematic approach. And I think one might perhaps apply his qualifications, his criticisms in the case of theodicy as well. What he claimed was that instead of simply a repetition in secularized form, what we had were new answers to old perennial questions. Questions that were not satisfactorily answered by religion, that needed new answers, which may, of course, in their turn be replaced by better ones in the future, but one was not simply legitimate, the other illegitimate. Now, in the case of theodicy, one might argue that in the 18th century, there was a recognition that a benign God, a God who intervened, a providential God, was no longer a player, we might say, in explaining either nature or society. And so something had to be concocted to answer a question. And that question is simply this: how, amidst the contingency and randomness of a world without a God either at the beginning or the end of the process, a God who caused or was teleologically there as a purpose, how out of that contingency did order emerge? How did regularity emerge? How was it possible to predict that you would wake up in the morning and the sun would shine once again? In other words, how is it possible to make sense of a world in which we have no subject who creates, no agent who is the beginning, no one who is responsible? Critique of the idea, say, of what is sometimes called occasionalism in philosophy, in which God intervenes at every occasion to explain a cause and an effect. Now the answer, and this is I think absolutely crucial, and it's an answer that is very nicely developed in a recent book by one of our colleagues at Berkeley, Jonathan Sheehan, writing in collaboration with Dror Warman, a book called Invisible Hands. The answer is basically self-organization. And Joseph talks a bit about this in his paper, but I want to extrapolate a bit more than he did to non-economic behavior. What invisible hands, what self-organization, what self-regulation or homeostasis suggested was that patterns emerge in natural and in social behavior without intentionality. Now, we're obviously familiar with this in the world of nature. Birds fly in a flock, fish swim in a school, crystals develop out of liquids. All these involve no initial causality. There's no way to argue they individually have intentionality. Something from the individual behavior produces a pattern. Now, whether or not this is a good pattern, a bad pattern, whether or not it helps in survival, whether or not it has a moral effect, that's something else. So in nature, this is quite clearly a powerful explanatory tool. It involves basically feedback loops. It involves mechanisms which I can't even begin to describe, but are cybernetic and that have qualities that do not involve mechanistic, gravitational-like determinism. So when Joseph said that basically the organizational principle of the invisible hand in economics is parallel with gravitational theories a la Newton in the 18th century, I think the argument of Sheehan and Warman would take us in a slightly different direction. Now, for nature, this is quite obvious. And if you go to Wikipedia and look at the article on self-organization, you'll find dozens, maybe hundreds of examples of how this operates in the cybernetic world of the present. How about in the social world? Well, we know in certain respects that, say, herd behavior, that reaching a critical mass, that a certain kind of suggestivity occurs in ways that allow us to make sense of probabilistically large-scale human endeavors that are not produced by any one individual intention, not produced even by the cumulative averaging of those intentions. So when Durkheim looked, for example, at suicide rates, they were constant over a long period of time in various contexts, not because you could point to a particular suicide or a particular intentionality, but because those rates operated in a probabilistic way. So probability emerges, and I'm not a social scientist, I can't use probability, I can't tell you what a Bayesian experiment is, I have no clue what that really is all about, but my understanding from the outside is that it does help us to make some sense of contingency. It gives us some sense of an order. Now, in the world of economics, and here too, I'm not here to defend the honor of the economics department or to claim that the predictions that Joseph, I think rightly says, were perhaps fallacious, were better than they were. I can't do that. But what I would say in the world of economics, there certainly has been a recognition ever since the 18th century that, first of all, something precipitated out and was disembedded from its context, which could be understood as a relatively, and I want to stress relatively, semi-autonomous system, a system that operated by rules of or protocols of behavior that were to a certain extent isolatable from the larger context, called religious or political, natural, whatever the larger context might be. And with Quinet and other figures in the 18th century, Smith of course as well, it was possible to isolate something called the economy. Now, we know that in many respects, ever since Karl Polanyi and the Great Transformation in the 1930s, that this was produced by basically a false assumption, which was that we were discovering natural laws, and that the social and political context had been somehow thwarting the expression of those natural laws. What Polanyi and others pointed to was the fact, no, these were in fact constructs. They were artificial. The economy is not something that is allowed to emerge when you get rid of all the mechanisms of trusts and guilds and of all the things we associate with a moral economy and mercantilism. No, it in fact is a construct. And we know quite clearly that this is a construct produced by politics. And I would agree very much with Joseph that capitalism doesn't exist without the capitalist state. It doesn't exist without the government. There's a recent book on Vogl, Jakob Vogl, the great early modern entrepreneur, which argues, it was just recently reviewed in the New York Review of Books, that early capitalism and the modern state were deeply imbricated. So no capitalism, no market without the state. Creating laws, creating the basis of contracts, creating safe boundaries, creating a monetary system, creating lots of different things that make it possible to have an economic system. And that's why, of course, they called it from the get-go political economy. It was never understood to be absolutely, completely isolated. Now, the myth of isolation, the myth of disembeddedness, certainly is one that one occasionally still hears, maybe in Manchesterite liberalism in the 19th century. Some people believed in it, maybe Milton Friedman, maybe some Republican propagandists today push it as if it were somehow self-evident reality. But I think most capitalists, economists and otherwise, would accept the fact that without state intervention there is no equilibrium. Equilibrium is a dynamic equilibrium in which there are always interventions. Now, in fact, as Joseph points out, the very fifth of his final stages describing the crisis of 2007, there was a restoration of the financial markets, still riding fairly high, with no one going to jail, a lot of people making an awful lot of money, the 1% getting richer and so forth. So there was, despite the fact that there was a crisis, an equilibrium that was reached with the help of the political system, with the help of the bailout, with the help of a variety of different policies which allowed the system to survive. Now, it seems to me that this is the larger lesson of the self-regulation model, that self-regulation is always itself imbricated in systems of steering mechanisms, and self-regulation. They're not an either-or, they are themselves in a kind of dynamic equilibrium. Now, crises sometimes get out of hand, and sometimes the steering mechanisms fail, and sometimes we end up with depressions or at least great recessions. I mean, he gave us a picture of the economist as basically not a dismal science, but a Pollyannish one. I think it's often argued that, for example, by Sheldon Wolin, Politics and Vision, that liberalism is dogged by anxiety about failure, about the fact that you can not only profit but also lose, that you can feel pain as well as pleasure. Liberalism is not quite as sunny or Pollyannish, but be that as it may, at certain moments it can be understood in those terms. Now, the issue of theodicy is also an issue of morality. It's not simply functional survival. It's not simply those birds flying around in a flock or the fish swimming in the sea. There's also something that involves God's goodness. Now, this seems to me a very, very difficult issue to deal with, because I think under certain circumstances, this involves essentially a teleology. It's not self-regulation. It involves the idea that evil in the world, that crises, are in the service ultimately of good, in the service ultimately of prosperity, wealth, abundance, whatever the functional goal of a market might be. Now, to a certain extent, under, I think, some circumstances, the equilibrium, let's call it descriptive equilibrium of the markets, it has been cloaked in a kind of moral carapace, which claims that somehow it's good for everybody to expand the market and prosperity trickles down and so forth. In many other respects, however, it is clearly athwart other versions of morality. And we know, of course, there are victims. And we know, of course, that people act on an individual basis in a selfish rather than altruistic way, and so forth. So that there is, I think, a less powerful moral dimension in economic notions of equilibrium and self-regulation than there might be in some of the others that one could think of. For example, Kant's notion of a social sociability in his idea for universal history and cosmopolitan point of view, which argues that even conflict or war can perhaps lead ultimately to a rational state in which practical reason is realized. And I want to go on and on about the issues of morality. I think it'd be very interesting to discuss whether or not that's the basis for the self-understanding of capitalism. I think one can, in many respects, see it as a system which understands itself to be relatively neutral in moral terms, simply producing wealth, which is good for some, not good for others, producing winners as well as losers. Casino capitalism, crony capitalism, whatever you call it, it's not conducive to egalitarian leveling. And I think most capitalists will accept that as a cost, a moral cost perhaps, or at least a morally neutral deficit of the system. Now, let me conclude, though, with the thought about what the alternative implicit in Joseph's argument is. Clearly, he's given us basically, I would say, two critical arguments. One, that economics as a science is basically fallacious. The predictions don't work, that it's derived from this early Theodicy notion. It's basically a fraud. The second is that the economic world, which it tries to describe, tries to predict in terms of future outcomes, is a world basically of chaos, a world of no patterns which can be discerned, no possible predictions, a world of fluctuations and of events. He calls them black swans in the book, things that just happen. Stuff happens, lightning strikes, tornadoes hit. There's no way to predict. Worse than meteorology, nothing is there except the chaos. Now, one could argue that the first of these is problematic. Maybe on some modest level, economists do in fact predict. As I say, I'm not here to defend their honor. They can do that better than I. The second, however, the idea that capitalism is inherently chaotic, inherently without any rhyme or reason, any occult even logic, seems to me difficult to maintain. We may not like the logic. We may find that it's a logic that produces losers, and we can very easily, I think, identify with them. But it's a logic that somehow is not totally entirely absent. And I put money in my stocks, and I hope that I'm going to get some sort of outcome. And usually, over a long period of time, I'll make some money. It's not absolutely random. Now, having said this, what is then the alternative? Well, obviously, it's not simply succumbing to contingency, accepting chaos. So the alternative, somehow, the implied alternative, is that there is possibly, and this in a way almost goes back to a more explicit Theodicy-like alternative, there is a synoptic position, a position of a rational organizer of the economy, a group or an individual or some sort of theory, which can get us beyond the chaos of capitalism. Now, what exactly would this look like? Would it be the command economies that we know from actually existing or formerly actually existing socialism? What exactly would it look like? And here I'm not so optimistic that we can come up with a better model which will in fact produce outcomes which are less chaotic. We know, for example, that from say the work of one of our former students, and I would like to push our own people, Jonathan Zatlin, a book called The Currency of Socialism, a book written under the directorship of my late colleague Jerry Feldman in the history department, that the East German economy, which attempted to get rid of money, attempted to get rid of credit, attempted to get rid basically of the finance system that is so problematic in Joseph's understanding of the world, was itself an utter failure, that it could not predict things. It did not have feedback mechanisms. It did not have the ability to know where to invest. It did not have a sense of understanding consumer desires. And as a result, there was basically economic chaos, which helped to undermine the system, political as well as economic. So command economies may be themselves, a bet that is just as, let's say, whatever socialists we want to be in our sentiments, a bet that is just as uncertain as the economic predictions of the capitalist economists. One final word about disembeddedness. One of the things, as I said earlier, that allows the economy to operate as an object of scientific inquiry, or social scientific inquiry, is its relative autonomy and disembeddedness from other contexts. Now, in many cases, the antidote to that is re-embedding, is to once again see the economy, and Joseph has a discussion of Aristotle's understanding of the economy as part of a larger whole, re-establish its connection to totality, something that Marxists have always argued against capitalism. Capitalism sees the economy as autonomous. Socialism in the future will reintegrate it into the world that, out of which it came, in which there are values, in which there are political processes, in which there is participation, in which there is some way in which it's no longer automatic. It is in fact directed. Now what's interesting, and I would just finish with this as a provocation, I mentioned the idea of a dismal science. This is a term that I'm sure as many of you know was coined by Thomas Carlyle. Now it's often assumed that Carlyle directed it against Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo, early 19th century British economists, who were very pessimistic about the way in which the economy would operate. Malthus because of population pressure on the food supply, Ricardo because of an iron law of wages. But in fact, when he coined it in 1849, in his occasional discourse on the Negro question, a work which 3 or 4 years later was republished, was in fact given an even uglier title, the Nigger question. When Carlyle introduced this, he was not directing against Malthus, not directing against Ricardo, directing against liberal economics, the Pollyannish, relatively Pollyannish economics of the mid-19th century Manchesterite liberalism, especially in the person of John Stuart Mill. And what was Carlyle trying to do? Well, he was trying to re-embed economics. What Mill had done, what the liberals had done, was to disembed it and make it into a system in which every individual was equal, in which every individual was a consumer or producer, in which there was a kind of leveling of hierarchical distinctions in nature and otherwise. What someone like Carlyle, who was not a very attractive character, tried to do, say, no, we have to in fact take nature and biology into account. And slavery, which he wanted to defend, was embedded in nature, and that the idea that everybody could be equal, well, this was nonsense. So re-embedding the economy is in some ways a noble goal, but it depends what you re-embed it in. And without that, without the very clear understanding of what in fact the economy might be re-embedded in, we're left with a kind of critique, but one that does not provide, I would say, a very hopeful alternative. Now, I don't have myself an answer to that. And you know, Joseph, the book doesn't end with answers. So this is, in a way, just to push the argument a little bit further, to tell all of us that we have to really think through what it means to, in some way, think of alternatives to the relative equilibrium, the relative capacity of self-regulation in markets, and to be a little bit nervous about the implication that by abandoning them, we will achieve some sort of justice, some sort of actual virtue, actual goodness, some sort of theodicy, like the one that Leibniz in the 18th century thought would come from those partial evils that would lead to a greater good. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you, Joseph, for these wonderfully thought-provoking presentations. I also think there's a great provocative tension now that we're left with. So I would like to invite both of you back here, and I'm assuming that you're prepared to take some questions. This is also an economic event, so Stanford University Press has brought some books. They have arrived and they're there on the table, so they're available for purchase. And also there's a sign-in sheet going around. In the age of shrinking budgets, everything has to be accounted for. So in order to earn your glass of wine, you have to put your name down. So let's have some discussion, and then Well, some people are already refreshing, so that's also a possibility. But I also don't want to break up the momentum now. So I invite questions from the audience. Should we get you a chair, or are you okay? Questions? There is one.
Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you think the theory you lay out in this book helps you understand more specifically what's been going on in the last few years between Greece and Germany. And you could say there's a sort of similar myth that that austerity works when there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, right? Which many people have brought to the fore. I mean, do you think that's a direct parallel, or does this theory sort of help us understand further what's going on in that situation?
Yes and no. So what I presented today was directly related to this book, The Spector of Capital. And in this book, I tried simply to understand a certain logic of economic theory. This was the center. In the last book, I changed the perspective and I asked, how is economic system, and especially financial system, organized as a sort of, in the words of Michel Foucault, as governmentality. So how does power relation function in financial economy? And there is one main thesis, a very important thesis, that finance as a phenomenon emerges only in symbiosis with state power and with sovereign power. This you mentioned. This is probably also the case of the Vogl in the book you mentioned, which was reviewed in New Book Reviews. And this genealogy or emergence of finance is still valid until today. So you can't compare finance as a moment of governance and as a moment of power. You cannot compare it to economic phenomenon of, for example, exchange, etc. And the relationships in Europe, relationship between the so-called institutions, that means IMF, European Central Bank, but also the representatives of creditors, showed exactly this form of power by usurpating, by taking over really sovereign competences like budget rights, like rights of labor rights, like social security, etc. So I think this is a very clear, nearly exemplary demonstration of this kind of structuring of financial power.
A quick follow-up on that. First of all, with respect to the first part of your argument about the mathematics, and particularly physical models behind economics, if the math doesn't work, then it becomes arbitrarily complex. So you mentioned things like time series, non-isotropic, all that. This basically is an index that it's no longer really mapping a real domain. But that's not really the question I want to ask. It's a follow-up on that question. If we look at the sequence of what happens, we know from Fabrice Tour's testimony at his trial that what basically happens with Germany and the rest of Europe is that basically Goldman Sachs sells a whole bunch of crap to German banks. They then bet against it. And there comes a moment where the Germans are basically going to have to try and get their money back either from Wall Street institutions or from countries like Greece and Ireland. Tim Geithner intervenes and says that Ireland is actually going to pay up in 2010. So basically this makes the whole thing all political, and the result of that has been a breakdown of the political systems in Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and countries like that. Isn't this problematic, and how do you think we should proceed from where we are at the moment?
It's a big question. First, I think not all the cases are similar. So the crisis in Greece has a completely different pattern than, for example, the breakdown in Spain or Portugal, because Spain had a completely sane budget, different to Greece. But there is one element which can be compared in all these cases. And by the way, it didn't begin in the European crisis. It didn't begin in 2008. It began in the 70s in the so-called emerging states, the states of the so-called third world, and their relationship to the EMF especially. And this means that there was a policy to bring states, societies, national economies in what economists call the prison of the market. And this means that there is a situation where certain reforms, for example, social reforms, reforms in labor rights, etc., immediately lead to something which can be called capital flight. This was a big problem of Argentina. This is now the problem of Venezuela, Brazil. This is the problem of Chile, for example, etc. So to lock states and their society into a sort of prison of the market, and this was a political intent. This was a political purpose. And the conclusion is very easy and very clear and very direct. How to say in English? All measures who could minimize these bonds to the market, who could minimize this prison-like bonds to especially financial market, each measure would be helpful.
Hi. So I have a kind of two-part question that's about stuff that came up in the talk as well as in Professor Jay's response to it, but also some things just from my reading of your book. There was a line in the last chapter where you opposed the idea of, as you put it, systemic consistency on the one hand, as it's put forward in the kind of the liberal oikodecy, versus the wilderness of historical contingency. So I'm going to ask about this relationship between contingency and the kind of German semantics of Kontingenz on the one hand, and system in a couple different ways. And so one of the ways this comes up is Professor Jay asking us, so what's the alternative? One of the things you offer is sort of an affirmation of that wilderness of historical contingency. We need a theory that affirms the inexplicability of its object, is one of the things that you say. So this kind of vague sense, maybe an affirmation of a kind of anarchic order. It's unclear to me exactly where that's going. But my larger concern, I guess, is that opposition of system and contingency, especially in light of the fact that you seem to draw very heavily on the work of Niklas Luhmann, for one, in your book, as well as the students like Dirk Becker and Elena Esposito in that last chapter. You cite all of them, and in the very framework in which you seem to oppose this sort of Laplacian version of physicalism in science that might correspond closely to first order or trivial machines, to something where you're trying to describe how the market actually works in terms of second order dynamics or non-trivial machines, use that language. In which case, in the second model, the correct understanding of the system has nothing to do with equilibrium anymore. It's not about opposing contingency, but systems are themselves, as autopoietic, another term that you sort of appropriate from that discourse, as autopoietic, they're constantly in flux, not just dynamic equilibrium, but constantly changing even the criteria for what might count as equilibrium, right? So that those things aren't even opposed anymore. And the other part has to do with the use and affirmation of the term contingency, which again, as Professor Jay pointed out, this implication of this Enlightenment unmasking through showing the religious origins of something, this is really a kind of theodicy. But in fact, the whole heritage of the provenance of the term contingency itself comes out of a very theological context, and the affirmation of contingency itself, as Blumenberg himself once said, it's one of the few philosophical terms of a truly Christian metaphysical provenance. It doesn't go back to the Greeks. And then tried to even say that the atomists, for example, asserting the idea of the swerve or the Klinemen, and you mentioned that when bringing up Mandelbrot in your book, that there was an affinity between atomism and voluntarism already. Sort of he speculates on this origin. Part of the reason contingency becomes so important to modern self-organizing systems thinking was that affinity between the absolute leap and the arbitrary act of God's will. And so in affirming contingency as opposed to theodicy, is it not just an option for different kinds of theology if you're going to go down that path, I'm asking?
Okay, a lot of questions. So let's take the last one. By the way, I'm not adherent of this thesis of secularization, and I think I made it very clear in this book, because there's a completely different movement. It's very interesting, and Giorgio Agamben showed this in one of his last books, that the condition that the notion of economy could be applied to mundane situations, the condition for this was the theologication of the old Greek oikonomia. Oikonomia, this means the household, became the key concept for the relationship between God, the Trinity, and the actions of God on earth. And this universalization of the notion of economy was the condition that one could describe fluctuations, relationships, etc. on earth with the same concept. This means the theologication, if it's possible to say, the theologication of a concept was the condition for its use in economic respects. This is not a secularization thesis. And you can even show that the Theodicy of Leibniz itself operates internally with economic concepts, completely economic. The most important term in there is efficiency. The best of all world is an efficient world. And this efficiency is guaranteed by divine economy. The first moment. The second is, I do not oppose theory and chaos, economic theory and chaos. I think, and this is not my own idea or my obsession, that one can rethink the structure and the frame of economic theory or knowledge. And in Germany, there are some, especially younger economists, who claim two things simply: that economic theory has to be much more sociological than a mathematical theory first, and in its inner consistency, it is struggling with historical timelines. It's in historic science, and you cannot model historical processes in mathematical models. So these two implications are very important now in a sort of epistemic struggle about economics, not in mainstream economics, but, for example, in Germany, students created a club which is called Club for Plural Economics, for undermining, in a certain way, orthodoxy. And last very important moment is, I tried to show, probably I didn't succeed, I tried to show how a certain set of theories is permanently making decisions without saying to make a decision, because these decisions are automatically made. And even Morgenstern, who I cited at the end, who was very lucid about this economic prognosis, prediction stuff, he said it, instead of relying on theory, instead of relying on prognosis, which shall in a certain way program behavior, there must be economic decisions. They cannot be transferred to the automatism of the market. So these are probably the three answers.
Too much.
So obviously we're talking about this sort of financial capitalism at a time when neoliberalism is sort of at the apex of its unpopularity, at least in the United States. And it struck me reading Spector of Capital that the expert class, the economists, are now sort of the new like theologians, cleric philosophers, and the oikadicy that you're talking about is a ruling class ideology. I don't think that most people who are like supporting Trump or Bernie Sanders even are thinking about it in these terms of justifying it based on efficiency and I'm drawing the parallel. I'm struck by the idea that Theodicy is sort of not done anymore, right? Like nobody takes it seriously intellectually. The power structure that rationalized it, as you point out, was already on its way out by the time of Leibniz and Kant, and by the time of Nietzsche, it's clearly not a winning battle. But then Nietzsche is the one whose ethics sort of serve as a justification for the sort of the intellectual godfathers of neoliberalism, Hayek, von Mises, later Milton Friedman, who you discuss extensively. And I'm wondering, it makes me think of Coy Robin's article, his essay about Nietzsche and neoliberalism in the Austrian school, where he sort of makes the argument that the market in the 20th century after fascism becomes the new battlefield, where the entrepreneur reasserts the hierarchy that was threatened by the downfall of aristocracy and the church. So Nietzsche sort of helps dissolve theodicy as an intellectual pursuit, but also helps, posthumously, obviously, to resurrect it in the form of oikadicy. My question is, can an ethics even sort of dissolve this market worship, or are we not at the point where ethics can even be, there isn't even an ethical argument against neoliberalism or neoclassical models? Is neoliberal market worship essentially only going to be replaced by a more accurate predictive model, where sort of let God sort them out as has been replaced by let the market sort it out, and there's no moral argument that can even be made. It's all an issue of technocratic pragmatics.
So I think it's very difficult to talk about liberalism because there are so many liberalisms. I just want to remind that at least we can discern three completely different types of liberalism. This is the classic liberalism from Adam Smith. You must remind, for example, that the market Adam Smith described didn't really exist. This was a project of emancipation, and the market should have been a motor of civil emancipation for Adam Smith. I told that this book was the second book of a course of moral philosophy, and when he made an apology of the market, it was an apology of civil society. These are synonyms in Adam Smith. There exists a third form of liberalism, which I cited with Hayek and probably with Friedman, the so-called neoliberalism, and there it's very clear that the market became a sort of political decision-making machine. But there is a second very important aspect or version of liberalism. It's the old, nearly forgotten German ordo-liberalism. And even this liberalism was not really coherent, completely different authors. But to make an example, Alexander Rüstow was one of the famous ordo-liberalists, and he was in exile, in Turkish exile in the Second World War. He wrote at the end, at the beginning, after the end of the Second World War, he wrote this strange sentence. There are, and you mentioned it in a certain way, there are two determinisms which we as ordo-liberalism must oppose. This is the liberalism of the so-called planning economy, you mentioned it, and this is the determinism of the market. These are, and I cited literally, subtheologische Phänomene, sub-theological phenomena. So there was a sort of liberalism who was extremely opposed to the self-regulated forces of the market, or if they are working only a very located, very limited situations. First thing. Second thing, I think it could be very interesting to look at forms of liberalism who try to get moral competence. And I would say that something like Nietzsche may be an example for it. The normal mainstream liberalism does not gain moral competence, but delegates moral competence to decision-making automatism. And there is some, if you want, it's a sort of freak liberalism like in Nietzsche, where you see something upcoming, like the figure of the entrepreneur, like the figure of complete freedom, but with all its consequences. And there is an ongoing discussion in the moment that the late, and this is probably similar to your setting, a discussion about the late Foucault and his relation to liberalism. Because if you read the lectures at the Collège de France on governmentality, there are some hidden sympathies for some liberalistic thought. But I would always underline one thing, and this concerns especially the 19th century. You cannot forget that the 19th century was extremely productive in create political ideas. From Nietzsche, several liberalisms, the socialist, Marxism, etc. And when we talk about political ideas today, you have the impression that there's a sclerosis of political imagination. And I would add one thing. I have the impression that special forms of light liberalism are in a certain way responsible for this sclerosis of political imagination, in where the forces of the market and the beauty of the market claims our own, if you want, political fantasy.
Can I just one extremely, I think, suggestive point concerning the gap between the utopian pretensions of capitalist theory, market theory, and reality. One could argue this is true of virtually every political economic system. Let's say socialism was always something that was to be achieved, but is not yet there. No socialist country thought it was truly communist or whatever. Democracy, we now know, is always of an even. It's always to come. We live in a society that is not an enlightened society, but is confident in a society that is en route into an age of enlightenment. So there's always this gap between aspiration and reality, always a gap between utopia and realization. So the issue for capitalism seems to me is not so much that the market fails to do lots of things that it pretends to do, but rather how we can approach some sort of self-regulation, because the other model of absolute control, either a command economy, I mean, I think to this extent the order liberals are right, or an economy which is utterly chaotic, both of these go kind of crazy bad directions, that we have to get the balance somehow better. Now, this is always asymptotically towards a utopia that's never achieved, but that we can't use the lack of realization as a way to say that the model is inherently problematic, because we do that with virtually every other model of justice or political equality or anything that we want is always going to fail. So I'm not sure that that, let's call it rhetorical strategy, is as effective as it might be. And the second point has to do with Theodicy. And if we take seriously the argument that Theodicy is an explanation for the way in which evils produce ultimate goods, then it's precisely because of crises, because of the series of constant fluctuations, that we can have a larger progress towards some sort of better alternative. So it's not as if equilibrium means stasis or means some sort of basic order today. It's a dynamic order which includes and maybe overly justifies the negative parts of it. It's almost a Hegelian notion of negation being necessary as a motor of future progress. So I think that's another way in which folding in the negative into the positive, rather than seeing the negative as a refutation of the positive, gives us a slightly, I would say, less black and white version of it.
So when you talked about the prison of the markets, there is, this is combined that there can be freedom beyond markets. And probably some markets do not really deliver freedom. And I think there are some front lines in political discussion today which are very important. And you can, I think, where some of our decisions are made. The first, and this was seen in Europe, is the distinction between the so-called democratic public, voting, having votes, going to elections, etc., and the other minority, especially minority, is the financial public, which dictates decisions, for example, for debitors, etc. I think this in the European crisis was a clear front line, and you have to deal with. And you saw that Syriza and the government tried to make this technocratic problem of paying debts into transform it into a political problem, which didn't work because powerful Germany was against it. So this is one front line. Another front line, and this concerns market, not against market. It's, and I think it's in the United States like in Europe, is the question how to define something like public goods. Is education a public good or can it be privatized? Is health a public good or can it be privatized, etc.? And this discussion is going on. This is going on in Latin America, this is going on in Germany, and I think this is a very important problem in the moment. And the third, probably the third discussion is in which range and under which conditions do which markets really function. And you see that, for example, and this was part of my talk today, financial markets do not function like markets of demand and supply. Thank you. Of demand of supply, because the logic is completely different. If something, if the prices rises, it's rational to buy and not to sell. They are completely different. This means positive feedback mechanism, which make the inherent instability of this market one of the points. So I think it's worth a discussion in which range, in which register markets can really function as something giving order or giving whatever.
If I may jump in for a second, you know, since you mentioned Rousseau and you know, so his idea of liberalism, I guess, was also a regulated, socially regulated market. And it seems to me that also we were discussing this earlier in the seminar. You know, the kind of global scale of displacements that we are seeing currently, that you know, that notion of socially regulated almost doesn't hold anymore, because you know, there is no sense of a collective that is backing that with a sense of solidarity. Also, so you know, where is the instance of regulation in the scale of, you know, global finance transactions, and where does all this theory formation then leave the people who are left homeless by you know, by the effects of the crisis? So, you know, these are questions that are on our horizon, but big problem. Yeah.
Very short answers. So, economists now, some economists talk about, for example, international, global financial markets, not about deregulated markets, but about highly regulated markets, but regulated under a certain condition that private investors and private firms give themselves their own rules. This means the so-called Schiedsgericht, arbitrations, etc. So there's no free market. This is a highly regulated undertaking for the profit of a certain cast of enterprises. This is not free. You cannot enter this market. Impossible. This is not accessible because there are so many rules and so many also qualitative and quantitative rules. So the notion for this is regulated capitalism, not deregulated. Highly regulated capitalism, especially in financial markets. Second, I can only top your observation. I think it was the clear vision of Reagan and Thatcher that the so-called welfare compromise after the Second World War could be broken down because this system supports much more much more misery than you thought. You can deliver 40% of Americans coupons for eating or whatever, but it does not really end the system. And this was, I think, the clear vision. We do not need a long so-called welfare compromise. It's the same in Germany. And let's the misery grow. It does not really disturb the system.
Especially if it's far away.
Yeah.
Okay. So if there are no more questions, then I'd like to thank Joseph and also Marty very much. And thank you all for holding out this long. And now is the time to raise a glass to Mosse. Thank you all very much.